Hi and welcome back. And today we'll start with the painting and weathering of the Sherman Tank. This is for Steve Mottram's M Group build. And I always like to start with the tracks and just a base coat of the Tamiya grey. And then I like to get down a layer of Vallejo gunmetal and do a couple of thin coats of that, just build it up a little bit. I like to have the gunmetal in there as the base coat. Later on when you're starting to weather and you might be scratching away some paint and getting perhaps a little bit of rough treatment on the tracks, at least don't show any sins. They'll show a little bit of metal underneath, which I think looks realistic. Then I put a few thin coats of black just to darken things up and get into the recesses. Again, some of that will get wiped off later on in the weathering process, and then add to that just a little bit of rust and pigments and that to finish it all off. But at this point, just go to work with a mixture of white spirits and artist oil, so primarily black with some burnt umber in there as well, not a lot. And you don't really see it very well in the video, but when it dries, it gives a good tonal difference in the highlights or the lowlights of the tracks, in fact. So on with the painting, and I really just used one little box set of paints, which was the AK Interactive US Olive Drab, and that comes with 6 of the 17mm dropper bottles, and the colours are fantastic. And really I just started with the darkest colour, which was the Olive Drab Shadow, and put that on fairly heavily around the base there of the lower hull and the wheels in particular, because I wanted them to be in shadow. And my only issue with the AK stuff, and it's the first time I've probably used them extensively, is I found them really hard to spray in my airbrush. Now that might be my airbrush and the combination of the humidity and the temperature in the room and all sorts of stuff like that, but I'm reminded of Mick Cohen's issues that he has with some of the MIG products in trying to spray them as well. And I think for me, perhaps in my environment, it's the AK stuff, because it was a bit of a beast to get it down. It needed lots of thinning, and sometimes it was too thin, at times it wasn't thin enough, and I reckon I cleaned the needle about 100 times. So it came out all right in terms of the colours, but it was it was a bit of a pain to get it down. So you'll see over the next couple of minutes just progressively using lighter shades of the AK paint, just bringing up some highlights and basically doing the modulation as the colour tones get lighter and lighter. So I'll leave you just to watch that, because you don't need me talking all the way through that, and a little bit of music for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll come back as we get stuck into more of it. So on to painting the rubber wheels, and I just mixed up a little bit of the Vallejo black, a few drops of the German field grey, and just a little bit of white to taste really, and that's just to make the black not as black, to replicate that sort of slightly worn rubber look, and it seems to come up alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. So I made a bit of a mistake here in that I didn't mask off the plastic for where the bogies were to be attached, and courageously just went ahead and applied the glue and hoped for the best, and look, 5 out of the 6 stuck fine, but I had one recalcitrant one that wanted to keep falling off and ultimately had to use a bit of super glue on him to get him back under control. But overall, I think they came up pretty nicely. This is well before weathering, of course, but I think they look reasonably good. And in many respects, it was a really easy paint, because before I knew where I was onto the tools and just about to get stuck into the weathering. So with the tools, I just give them a base of the gunmetal for the same thinking behind the tracks, and then picked out the timber parts where necessary, and just washed them to sort of weather them appropriately. And on with the weathering. So I used the MIG pigment, the European Earth, and to help stick it on, I used just the filter, the 3-tone camo, which worked quite well. I'd never tried that before, so I was happy with the results. Really, just splash on the filter, being somewhat careful, and then get the pigment onto it fairly quickly. It's really to taste. You put as much or as little as you like. I put a bit more on, perhaps, than I planned to. I think I got excited by the whole process, but rubs off quite easily, as long as you don't spray a dull coat in there to fix it permanently. So I went back with the toothbrush a little bit later on and cleaned off any of the what looked like was obvious excesses. Then just a matter of getting in around the wheels, and pretty liberal with the filter again there. And I think for me the biggest thing with this is you can always take stuff off, and I just sort of try and keep it pretty random. So I go heavy with the pigments towards the back, because I think that's where the most mud and dust would probably stick, and then try and vary it up in terms of on the wheels and on the bogies and the drive sprockets and things like that, just to give it a bit of variation again. And as I said before, you can always go back later on when it's dry, and I just use a toothbrush and gently give it a bit of a scrape. I think it comes up pretty well. The thing I like about it is when it dries, it looks so natural. It looks really good as far as replicating that sort of mud dust effect. So just a couple of shots of that finished product, and just a bit of a close-up side view of the wheels, which I think came up pretty well. That's what I was saying before about the weathering does hide you worry about getting a little bit of black paint on the rim of the metal of the wheel, but the reality is you'll never see it in the finished product. So I'd had a minor trauma with the gun barrel, in as much as and it's all my fault, I just used too much glue, and I'd been really careful throughout the build to be sparing with it. So that had over melted the plastic, and it had left a nasty little depression around there in the gun barrel of all places where it's so obvious. So I had to get the green stuff out and do a little bit of repair work there, and it was just a matter of being very patient and taking my time, and use a little bit of water to help it adhere to the barrel initially, and then once I felt it was in place and it was semi-set, then again with some water on the edge of the round sculpting tool, just polished it really to get it as flat as possible to both ends, and then very carefully cleaned up, not touching the green stuff itself, just the barrel to get any of the residue off. So then I just start going around and picking out some highlights, and again I use the Vallejo gun metal, and just to put the first highlight on for where any of the exposed metal might be from a chipping perspective, and again with a very fine brush, and being reasonably careful, but in many cases it doesn't matter because it'll be layer upon layer, but you don't want to be splashing it around willy-nilly. And just a couple of pictures now of what that looks like before we move on to the next stage. So moving on to the decals now, and not a huge range in the kit. There's just the typical white stars and a couple of serial numbers. So I use the normal setting solution and softening solution, and just be careful. Obviously, use a paintbrush and a cotton bud just to wipe away any of the excess, and then don't play with them. I think that's my best tip. Once you get them in the right spot, leave them alone, and then go back with the setting and softening solution, and just be very careful. And I nearly butchered this beyond repair. Sometimes they just don't cooperate, and you need to get a little bit of metal involved, but you have to be super duper careful. And I'd had a go at making a couple of my own, and I had limited success with that. So I think it's probably time just to talk about this specific tank, because it is based on an actual combat situation and a very specific action, in fact. So this is a tank that was commanded by an American officer called Jack Lee, and he joined up the Army in 1942 and was, after his training, assigned to the 12th Armoured Division, Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion. So that unit was initially equipped with the early model M4 Sherman medium tank. Jack had developed a reputation for mental alertness and aggressiveness during his training, and they shipped out from the US in 1944 and were stationed in Tidworth Barracks in the UK from September to November, preparing for their journey to France. And at that time they were re-equipped with a new tank, the M4A3, and Lee and his crew named this tank the Besotten Jenny. Lee first saw action on December 9, 1944, and was noted as performing well under combat in his first ongoing combat followed, and in mid-January 45 the 12th Armoured Division engaged German forces who were attempting to retake Kreuzberg. The 12th Armoured Division crossed swords with the crack 10th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, and the battle resulted in just over half of the 23rd Tank Battalion's tanks being destroyed. Replacement tanks came through, and Jack and his crew got a new M4A3E8, and that's the tank that I'm making here. Lee was also awarded a Bronze Star as a result of his courage and leadership during the battle against the 10th SS Panzer Grenadiers. So back to my attempts at making waterslide decals, and I just wanted to do a couple of things like the unit marking and just some serial numbers just to see how it would come out. What I discovered, of course, was that with an inkjet printer you can't print white on the transfer film. So I went for the lighter shades of grey that I could, and thought perhaps that would come out okay. So when you use an inkjet printer to print on the inkjet decal paper, once it's dry, and you have to be very careful about that, then you need to spray it lightly with a dull coat, and you probably need to do 4 or 5 coats of that, and that's to seal the ink in. And so I did all that very carefully and applied the first transfer, and I think the mistake I made was I used some setting solution, and that just obviously chewed through the dull coat, and all the letters disappeared before my very eyes. So I had to go again and take that off, and I cut a lot closer to the letters this time around as well, and I just applied them with water, but the results were terribly disappointing, as you'll see. So this is the second attempt, which was just applied with pure water, and I cut the transfer paper as close to the printing as possible. The lettering stayed on, but as you'll see in a second, once it started to dry, it was just the transfer paper was very thick, and there was just a lip all the way around the edge, and I think because of the cutting that was accentuated, and you can sort of see it there. I think I was so devastated I forgot to take any more pictures than this. Anyway, that all ended up coming off as well, because it just looked horrible. When it was fully dry, it was like it had a silver pen liner around the edges. So we're nearing the end of the painting phase now, and just gluing on the tools. Again, I did that really carefully, just the tiniest brush and just a few little dots. I've really tried to refine getting the small parts on by using the least amount of glue possible, and I think this build worked well, with the exception of the barrel where I went a little bit overboard. But again, as with most Tamiya parts, everything just clicked into place so easily. There was very little mucking around, and if I had a problem, it was really just with my clumsiness rather than a fit issue. So all the bits and pieces went on quite comfortably. Very happy with the overall look of it all. And that just one last stage to go, which is the final weathering, and we'll have a look at that next. So this time I continued with the experimenting with the pigments and mixed up some of the European Earth pigment with quite a little bit of thinners to try and make a relatively weak mix of it all, and then applied that fairly liberally. And as is my normal process, I always put too much on at the start. But then I like to continually just to take it off, and I really like letting the mineral spirits or the thinners run down the sides to give that sort of stained effect. I quite like that. So really just went and applied this all over, waited till it had dried, mostly dried, and then started to remove, and probably had about 3 or 4 passes at removing. But I wanted it to be very heavily weathered, so the tank had taken off in quite a hurry, and they'd had to assemble a little bit of a task force to go off on their mission, and were hammering along at a pretty fast pace along some unsealed roads. So I think there would have been a lot of dust being thrown up. There was a little bit of a tank convoy which gradually got smaller and smaller for various reasons, and I'll talk about that in subsequent videos. But I wanted it to look very dusty, not muddy so much, but dusty and well worn. They got into a bit of a firefight on the way to where they were going as well, so there was a little bit of action and what have you. And I think ultimately, we'll have a look at the video, do the 360 in the final reveal. I think it's come up quite well. So we'll just do the 360 now, and the only thing that's happened that I didn't film, and I apologise for that, was just using the pigments. So just continue to aim for that dusty surface by using the pastel chalks, and used all sorts of colours, greens and olive greens and light greens and browns and light browns and beige and grey, and just wanted to get a really well-worn dusty look. So as we spin around there, I'll just set up the rest of the story for the next video, which will be building the Dio base. We were talking about Jack Lee and the command of his tank, the Besotten Jenny, which is what this tank is depicting. But the story that captured my attention I saw over 12 months ago, I think, when I was first sort of getting back into the hobby and doing some research. And this is an amazing story, which probably most people know, but I hadn't heard of it before. And captured my imagination because I thought it would make a really good subject for a diorama. So if we could just go back to May 4, 1945, and after seeing prolonged action, Lee and his men were billeted at Kalfstein. I hope I said that right. And expecting a theatre-wide ceasefire to be announced within the next 24 hours. So the men of the 23rd were thinking that for them the war would soon be over. However, the sudden arrival of a Wehrmacht officer under a white flag changed all of that. They were soon to embark on an amazing rescue mission. They were on their way to Schloss Itter, or Castle Itter, which is often referred to as the last battle. And there's a great book that's been written by a chap called Stephen Harding, which is my main reference source in terms of what this battle was about. I'll just show that up on the screen as well. But fundamentally, the only time ever where American forces and German forces fought together alongside some French political prisoners and some Austrian partisans or freedom fighters against some SS troops who were trying to recapture the castle. So lots of interest there for me, because lots of different figures that will come into the diorama and uniforms and what have you. So fascinating story. I'll talk more about it. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't already subscribed, don't forget to subscribe, and that way you'll be kept up to date with all of the new releases. And if you liked the video, thumbs up, and really look forward to reading your comments, guys. So thank you again, and I'll catch you in the next one.